At least six.
Oh, 6. Oh, that's a tough one. I want to take the under on that.
I'll have the over. And
You take the over, I'll take the under, and yeah, we'll do Burlington.
Is it like
Quinn, can you hear me? Testing, 1, 2, 3.
It has a water jet with it, or you gotta have a separate water jet?
If I unmute myself, you can hear me, but yes, I can hear you.
how you doing? Good. You getting healed up?
No,
Oh, sorry.
no, I got surgery next week.
Do you?
Did you hear me, Michelle?
Want me to talk again?
Dave?
Quinn,
You know, the
can you hear me?
I think
Yes. Can you hear me?
in the shoulder and.
Yeah.
Hey, we're having a problem. We can't hear you.
All right. Let me figure it out.
Yeah.
We gotta hit pause on the injury bug.
Want me to have these guys be quiet for me?
Yeah.
Check this
Can you
out.
hear?
Yeah.
Why is it the two next to me that are sick?
Cute hair, by the way.
Are we not hearing Quinn?
Quinn's not coming. He's sick. He's remote.
I'm here, but
Whatever.
Yeah, we hear. Yeah, it's working. We just need, do we need to turn the volume up
When
on the
only one
sound?
person, when everybody's talking,
Yeah.
okay.
Mike's on?
Mics are on.
Hey, we're live.
We're live?
Mike's not on.
No, Angie.
Okay.
Now my
can you hear me?
Thank you.
Is my mic on? Is my mic on?
I'm in a position where I can.
I don't think my mic's.
Happy.
Is my mic on? Can you hear me through the mic?
Yes.
Okay.
Very loud and clear.
All right. Welcome, everybody. We're glad you could attend or watch at home our meeting of October 20th, South Weber City Council meeting. And it is now 6:01 p.m. We'd just like to excuse Councilwoman Petty. She is sick at home. And also Councilmember Soderquist is joining us remotely. So appreciate that. Good to
Hi,
see you.
Quinn.
Hello.
Okay. All right. So we will begin with the Pledge of Allegiance. I will give that. And then Councilman Halverson will give us a prayer. Please stand.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Our dear Heavenly Father, as we come before Thee this evening, we're very thankful for the opportunities we have to gather as a city and to participate in our city council meetings. And we're thankful for the country we live in and the freedoms we have. We're especially grateful for our law enforcement and our firefighters and all of our armed forces. We ask you to watch over them and protect them and to bless their families for their sacrifice. Father, we ask for Thy Spirit to be with us, that we may make the best decisions for the city and to understand our obligations that we hold. Father, again, we thank Thee for all that we have, and we say things in the name of Thy Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Councilman Halverson. Okay, jumping right into this, our code update committee spoke about, or was talking about Title 10 of the code, and a lot of questions arose about land use roles for the council, for planning commission, staff, and the public. And so tonight, we are grateful that we have Jamie Blakesley here. He's our city attorney, and he'll be speaking to us on this subject for a minute. And I would just like to make note that David Church, who's the former ULCT attorney, he recently retired, and Jamie Blakesley's partner, Todd Godfrey, took his place with the ULCT, and they have been discussing and come up with the words that Jamie will give to us tonight. So we'll turn the time over to him.
Thank you, Mayor Sojmo. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to everybody. Anytime I give a presentation as an attorney, I think back to my training, when you examine a witness, one of the things that you instruct the witness is if they're asked a question, as they can. And I once was asked to represent a law office in a discrimination matter, and the attorneys were the worst witnesses I've ever had. And so I'm going to try to take my own advice with this presentation and be as brief and as succinct as possible. Land use is a monstrously large topic, and there are corners and crevices that we could explore and go into. My intent with this presentation is not to talk about everything land use, but I've pared it down to the council, planning commission, and staff responsibilities within Utah land use law. And I wanted to run briefly through the context for those roles and responsibilities with an eye toward, at the end of the presentation, opening up discussion about those roles and responsibilities in our code as we go through the code update process. There are certain functions that are established by statute and we have to make sure our code conforms to that. And there are some functions that can be handled either at a planning commission, staff, or city council level. And I think a lot of our conversation will probably center on those decisions and those aspects. My goals today are fourfold. And Lisa, is my presentation up on the screen? Yeah, let's jump into the slides. And I have to be mindful that what I'm following here on my computer isn't.
Like to make note that we have monitors working this week as well.
Super.
Awesome.
Except for Jamie.
But I can see it, so we're good. If you'll jump to the next slide on our objectives. We'll talk a little bit about the legal framework. We'll talk about the powers and duties of the council, planning commission, and staff. The third point, maybe the most important, is that we want to make decisions as a city that are legally supportable and don't get us into hot water of litigation, but allow us to make the kinds of decisions that we want to make. Land use effects within the city are what we want them to be. And then the final point is to consider the best framework and have some discussion about how to apply the law to what we're doing. Next slide, please. As I visited with Todd, he felt like maybe the most important thing to reinforce is that in the state of Utah, it's the state that holds the land use authority. And with the exception of a few cities, every city within the state gets its land use authority from the state. And so it's the State Land Use Development and Management Act that controls. It's, of course, subject to the parameters and the confines of federal case law and federal statutes and state common law, but our city gets its authority from the state and is beholden to the state as we make our decisions. Next slide. LUDMA is the acronym that's used for the Land Use Development and Management Act. It authorizes, in broad terms, the city to adopt its own land use standards as long as they're consistent with other laws. And then it mandates three key things. One is you have to have a planning commission. The two is that you have to have land use authorities and appeal authorities. You have to designate those authorities within your city code. And then the third is that you have to adopt a general plan and a process for considering land use applications. And with that general plan flows zoning districts and the zoning ordinances that govern those. Next slide, please. There are 6 predominant themes in LUDMA, and as you read through them, you'll see that they're not always, they don't appear, at least on their face, to be consistent. And so there sometimes is a threading of the needle as you're doing land use work as a city council to make sure that you're mindful of these themes and respectful of the spirit of the law and the letter of the law. We're in a state that has a strong recognition for private property rights, but also gives cities broad authorities with very few exceptions for regulating the use of private property. Once a land use law is written, those regulations are binding both on the private property owner and on the city. Land use ordinance have to be plainly written to be enforceable. And one of the things you'll hear me mention over and over is that process matters. A land use decision can be overturned on its substance, but if you examine the case law and the history of decisions in the state, more often than not, it's the process that ends up unraveling a land use decision more so than the substance of the decision itself. And then the final point, and maybe one of the more important ones and one of the more difficult things to navigate, is that there is a provision in LUDMA that if the plain meaning isn't understood in a land use regulation and you have to err on how you would interpret the meaning of the regulation, you interpret the regulation to the favor of the applicant or the property owner, not to the benefit of the city. And so as we're drafting and working through our land use regulations, we want to be sure that plain meaning is plain and as detailed as it possibly can be, so that those decisions are predictable and that we can have some confidence in the decisions we make as a city. Next slide, please. The roles and responsibilities under LUDMA get interesting because the labels it affixes to things aren't the same as the labels of the entities that make decisions within a city. We have a city council, we have a planning commission, we have a city manager, we have a mayor. The names that LUDMA uses are legislative body, land use authority, and appeal authority. And in some cases, these persons or these bodies within a city can find themselves in one or more categories here. A legislative body, in our case, is the city council. That's the easiest one to define. There's no other entity within the city that's authorized to enact legislation and make law. The land use authority is the authority that will make land use decisions within a city. And as we get into this, you'll see that in some instances that can be the city council. Other instances it can be staff. Other instances it can even be the planning commission. And it can also be delegated to certain members of staff. It needn't be staff in general. And a land use authority is any person or entity that makes a decision about land use action. And then the appeal authority is a little bit easier to define. It is essentially what we decide it should be within our city code. It can be an individual, or it can be a body or a commission or something similar to that. And it's the entity that would hear an appeal from a land use decision made by a land use authority. And the only real restriction on who and what can be an appeal authority is that it can't be the same entity that makes the decision. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. The legislative body is the city council. Only, next slide, please, Lisa. Only the legislative body may enact a land use regulation. And you'll see in the code, there are some shalls and there are some mays, and I tried to use them here in the bullets, but you're required to adopt a land use regulation that governs how zoning districts are created and designates the general uses allowed in those districts. The other shall is that you have to consider every proposed land use regulation that the Planning Commission recommends. So there's a little bit of independence on the part of the Planning Commission that they can take up a land use matter, consider it, and make a recommendation to the council. The council is not obligated to adopt what the Planning Commission recommends, but you are required by statute to consider what the Planning Commission recommends. The two mays is that you may establish or modify other restrictions or requirements that relate to land use decisions, and that you may, but are not required to, establish a land use ordinance that allows for conditional uses and provides for the mechanisms for making decisions about conditional uses. Next slide, please. Land use authority, and again, this can be the city council, the planning commission, or the staff, is obligated to apply the plain language of a land use regulation. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we get into the difference between legislative and administrative decisions. If there is no plain restriction, then the land use authority is required to interpret and apply the land use regulation to favor the land use applicant. And then finally, on conditional uses, if a conditional use can be imposed that would mitigate a detrimental effect, then there's an obligation on the part of the land use authority to approve those conditional uses. And that's a little bit of the comfort and peril of a conditional use, and allowing for conditional uses depending on whether your perspective is that of the landowner or that of the city as you make those decisions. The appeal authority, finally, is the entity that hears and decides two things: variances and then appeals from decisions applying the land use ordinance. Again, it can be an individual or a multi-person board, body, or panel. And the appeal authority is limited in that it can only review matters that have become administratively final. And so you can't take one step in the land use approval process, decide you don't like the direction it's going, and appeal it. You as an applicant would have to take it all the way through the process. And then at that point, it would be ripe for appeal. Next slide, please. When I left government practice and entered private practice, one of the first matters I was assigned was a land use case that went to the Utah Supreme Court on an emergency writ because there was an effort by the citizens in the city of Holiday to place on the ballot a land use decision that related to a large tract of vacant land in the city. It was the former site of a mall that had been fallow for a few decades, and then there was a development proposal that came forward, and due to density and some of the entities involved, it was unpopular among the residents that lived near that location. So they sought to put it on the ballot and to overturn that decision. There were two aspects to the city's decision in that case. One was an approval of what they called a site development master plan, and the other was the approval of a development agreement that provided tax increment financing for certain public aspects of the project. And those two things went hand in hand to the Supreme Court. And when courts look at land use decisions, they put them in one of two categories. They'll look at administrative decisions and they'll look at legislative decisions. And one of the most important distinctions between the two is that a legislative decision can be taken to a vote of the citizens of a city to either affirm or overturn that decision. There's a process before it can get on the ballot, but I do think it's important to have in the back of your mind as you're making a legislative decision that, this is a legislative decision, and if it goes sideways, this is something where the citizens could take it to a vote and overturn the decision that's made. An administrative decision is one where the court doesn't view the action as making law, but it views the action as applying the law. And administrative decisions, you have less flexibility in making the decision, but once you make the decision, it's a decision where it can be appealed, but the appeal is only looking at whether you violated your authority under the law or the process that's required to be followed when you make a decision. Whereas with the legislative decision, you have pretty broad parameters within the policy considerations you're looking at to make decisions and choices. And then we have in a city these quasi-judicial decisions that are made by the appeal authority or a court that will examine decisions that have been made. I hope this matrix is something that we'll come back to as we're considering the various roles and responsibilities, but legislative decisions are the easiest because they can only be made by two entities. One is the city council or the other is the general electorate. Administrative decisions, there's a little bit more flexibility as to who can make them. It can be the council, planning commission, or staff. Conditional uses, site plans, development agreements, and subdivisions are all administrative decisions. And then all of the quasi-judicial decisions made within the city would be made by whoever we name to be the appeal authority, or if their decision is appealed, it would be made by a court. Excuse me. There are two restrictions on land use decisions that I felt important to highlight. One is that only a legislative body may amend those details of a land use decision. You'll want to go one slide back. There we are. If it relates to the number, shape, boundaries, area, or general uses of a zoning district, that has to be made by a legislative body. And a zoning district and its requirements can only be changed by a legislative body. But under all circumstances, it has to go to the Planning Commission first and then the legislative body second. Next slide, please. The two types of land use decisions, again, that are taken through the quasi-judicial process are appeals and variances. And I'll just note that on appeals and variances, the standard for overturning a decision is fairly high. To overturn on appeal, the decision has to have been illegal, arbitrary, and capricious. And to overturn a variance, there are 5 statutory criteria. They're fairly detailed. I don't know that I've ever seen more than a handful of situations where the variance criteria has been met by a person that wants to change a land use or a zoning ordinance. And then on judicial review, the appeal can come either from the applicant or it can come from an interested party. And an interested party is defined by anybody who's adversely affected by a land use decision. Next slide, please. Judicial review can look at 2 different things. Broadly, it can look at whether the ordinance itself is valid. And then the second thing it can look at is whether the application of the ordinance to the specific facts of the land use decision were done properly. On the application side, again, the standard is whether the decision was found to be arbitrary and capricious or illegal. And I'll note here, when you're making decisions, the way you avoid the arbitrary and capricious standard is by making sure that there's substantial evidence in the record for why you made the decision you made and how it relates to the legal standard that you're looking at. And as long as that evidence exists, then that's a decision that you can support if you're within the confines of what the law allows and you have that record established. And so as I'm advising you on things, you may hear me from time to time say, you can make the decision on that basis, but we need to have evidence in the record that would support the choice that you're making. You can skip, I think we've talked about this. And then finally, I wanted to note a few best practices for making land use decisions. In your mind, as you're making decisions, I do think it's helpful to think, is this an administrative, is this a legislative, and is this a quasi-judicial decision? And one of the things that we do with other clients is, for the Planning Commission in particular, and for the council where they share roles, is we may note on the agenda, this is an administrative decision relating to, and then note what the topic is, or this is a legislative decision relating to. And that can be a trigger for you that if it's a legislative decision, then you can factor in the popularity of the decision. You can factor in the public comment and the public sentiment. You can factor in any policy consideration that you think would be important to the decision. If it's an administrative decision, then those kinds of things have to be set aside. And I'll give an example of one that recently came up in another jurisdiction. There's a hotel project in one of the cities we represent that came before the Planning Commission. And where the hotel parcel was located, there was an easement that provided a private access road back to a half dozen homes that were located behind it. And the way the easement was written, the owner of the hotel parcel had the choice over where that access would be. They could put it on an edge of the property, or they could put it through the middle. And what they decided to do was run the easement right through the middle of their parking lot. And so these residents then, to get to their homes, had to go through a parking lot that had hotel patrons parked there. and obviously didn't like it as much as the more private access that they enjoyed before the hotel was being constructed. The only legal criteria, because of the strength of that easement, was where UDOT would grant access to the road. It wasn't a city road, it was a UDOT controlled road that fronted the hotel. And so the choice they were grappling with was, has UDOT approved this or has UDOT not approved it? And once UDOT approved it, then the question of safety was off the table. And it was a decision that this particular planning commission struggled with because they knew the residents didn't like the access. The members of the council didn't like the access. But in making an administrative decision, they were limited to what the law would allow in that circumstance. And because the easement was strong and because UDOT had already granted an approved access, they were without a legal lever for rejecting or approving the application on that basis. And we had to advise them in that circumstance that with it being an administrative decision, what you were looking at is whether it complied with the legal requirements on that site. And those administrative decisions, when you're a body that often makes legislative decisions, can sometimes be a little unpalatable because you're used to making choices based on policy considerations, and then you have another choice where it's not a policy consideration that you can consider, it's only a legal or an administrative consideration. The second key thing is to know what your role and responsibility is. And so we recommend thinking, okay, is this a legislative or administrative decision? Then you know how to make it. And then you think, okay, what is my role in this decision-making process? If you're a legislative body, then your role may be the final approval of that process. If you're a land use authority or an appeal authority, your decision may be to make a recommendation that another body will then approve or implement. On procedural requirements, I'll just note that it's advised to follow procedure exactly. If you make a decision and it's time sensitive, but a procedure that's required by law or by your code, then that can set back the process if you have to go back to point zero and then go through it again and do the appropriate notice and the like for making a decision. I encourage documenting decisions in writing. We have a recent example of a conditional use permit that was originally memorialized orally in the minutes of a city council decision. And I think those are always easier decisions to implement and defend and support and also enforce if when they're approved, even if it's done in an open meeting, that they're put to writing. The phrase I'll often use with clients is, if it's not written, it didn't happen. And from a legal perspective, that's often true. If it's not in writing, it's really hard to prove that it happened and that that's what the decision was. The other thing I have found to be important is to state the reason for your choices. And I think that's important because it helps put you in that box of, is it an administrative or is it a legislative decision? And if you're talking about the reasons for making the decision, you can say, this administrative decision I'm making because our city code states A, B, C, D, and this proposal does not meet D, and here's why. And if it's a legislative decision, then you can say, these policies are important to me, and this is the reason why I can or cannot support this decision. For legislative decisions, the public hearings are important and they're often required. I would encourage you, as you have those public hearings, even though they're lengthy, to consider them opportunities to learn and to gather information. Patience during those hearings will prove to your benefit when it comes time to make a decision, because an opponent of that decision can't challenge your decision as being poorly informed or rushed if they had every opportunity to provide you with information and you listened in good faith to that information. Again, on administrative decisions, know the law and apply it exactly. And then on the final 2 points, you'll have an opportunity, and this is probably more appropriate in a city the size of South Weber, In a large city, city councils can become quite burdened by budget decisions and other really large decisions that for you all may take a couple of months, but for a larger city may take half a year to work through as a council. That you might be able to take on some decisions that would otherwise have to be delegated. And so you'll have some choices to make about what things would you like to take on as a council, and what level of decisions would become a burden and interfere with your other obligations as a council. And I would just recommend that, wherever possible and wherever you're trusting of the Planning Commission and of staff to delegate decisions, that delegating decisions can often be to your benefit, because then you can have a little more bandwidth to make the other decisions that you need to make as a city council. But with a caution that if you do delegate, give clear direction in the code about what's expected and what is being delegated.
Can I ask you a question about that?
Bodies. Yes.
What is the process to doing that? I mean, is that also in paper? Is that in the packet of the meeting, or how?
The delegation would occur formally in the city code. So an example right now is conditional use permits. In many cities, conditional use permits will never rise to the level of a city council. They'll always be made either at a staff level or at the Planning Commission level. And the way your code is currently written, there are certain conditional use permit decisions that are made at the Planning Commission level. And then there are others that relate to commercial properties that are made by the council. And the council's retained that authority and not delegated it to another entity. So it's legally permissible for you to delegate all conditional use permits somewhere other than the city council. You can decide whether you think that's prudent or not, given the environment in the city and your other burdens as a council, but you have that choice as we look at it. You would make that delegation in the city code. And I'll note and Wayne's aware of this, one of the things we've been working through as we are in this code rewrite process is that those delegations, as it relates to conditional use permits and other things, there are contradictory provisions in the code that we've had to kind of work through and figure out, what's logically coherent with those delegations. There are some places where it states that CUPs are delegated to the Planning Commission, period. And then there are other places where it says these decisions are reserved to the council. And we've been able to find the path that we think is legally appropriate now based on the sections of the code those statements are in. But when we rewrite it, I would sure prefer to have those delegations be more clearly put.
Thank you.
That's everything on my overview of the land use decisions in that point you, and then I'm going to kind of step back and take a listening ear, but each of you have a document that was prepared by Taylor Walton as part of our working group. And I found it really useful. I've reviewed it and compared it to state code and to the city code. And I think he's accurately characterized how the roles and responsibilities are currently allocated among the city council, the planning commission, staff, and the appeal authority. I'll note that in city code right now, the appeal authority is an unbiased attorney with expertise in land use. It's an individual to whom that appeal goes. I don't see a reason to recommend anything different from that unless you have experience I'm not aware of that appeal authority not working. Other than that, I think the intent of the meeting today is to get general and broad feedback from you all, policy level feedback about how we ought to consider allocating these responsibilities in the city.
Mayor, could I ask a question
You may.
here? Just to clarify something, Jamie, could you explain what quasi-judicial means?
It's not a court of law, but they're making a decision in the same way that a court of law would make it. And it's a decision that, unless appealed, would be binding on the parties involved. But it doesn't have to be a judge that makes that decision.
And if my understanding is correct, appeal from that decision goes to court.
Yes.
Yeah.
This is not centered.
All right, so there are, first of all, comments or questions on the information that we've been given by Jamie.
Mayor, I think the questions will materialize as we get into the discussion. There's a lot of information that, thank you, Jamie, for preparing. He set the framework for the next agenda item that is really what the code committee was wanting to get to. And even though it talks about development approval process discussion, and it gave in our background memo, it gave a few direct questions. I guess the objective, and correct me if I'm wrong, Haley, we weren't looking for the city council to make a decision in regards to this matrix right now, but given the discussion that we had was to have a broader discussion as to what, the roles and responsibilities and how much of this delegation of authority are we comfortable with. Some of the dialogue that we had at the committee level surrounded the positivity we've had in the past with, say, residential developments going through. There seems to be a lot of comfort and confidence in how that process has played out. And I think it's because it's fairly clear in the different zonings as how residential should happen. When we get into the commercial, or hate to say it, mixed use, but since we no longer have mixed use, that's not a problem we have to deal with too much more. But the commercial, it's more of a newer concept, and there seems to be a lot more differences of opinion. Comments that we've heard come back as to how much does the council want to get into the weeds with regards to colors or architectural relief and things of that nature versus delegating those type of authorities. And rather than the committee taking a stab at it and bringing it back, we thought, let's have a comprehensive discussion as to where are we at, so we can take that back to the committee, and then the committee can absorb that information and fill in these boxes in the matrix as appropriate. Did I frame that correctly?
Yep.
Okay.
Well done.
So I'm looking to maybe the Dave and Jamie to help guide the discussion, help us come to some of those decision points, and maybe aha moments, and maybe we can get to that more quickly. That's my lead in, Mayor. How did I do?
You did great. So how do we want to do this?
Well, just to give you a start out in defining roles, what Jamie has explained to us now is what I would say is more of the approval aspect of any kind of development. There's also the enforcement or the administrative aspect of the development. There's actually 6 roles in the entire process. We talked about today the city council's role, the legislative. We talked about the planning commission role. Maybe that's the administrative, if we want to say that. The appeal authority is the 3 things he's talked about here. The other roles become more of a staff level, are zone administration, the zoning administration role, building inspection, and enforcement. Those can be individual roles. Those can be combined under one individual or multi, roles of some sort. But that's the other aspect of defining the roles. That's the next step that the committee is going to have to delve into as we look into these first couple of chapters. So we wanted to start on the, I hate to say legislative side, but start on that side of the.
And I should say on the legislative side is where there's the least amount of flexibility for how you fill in these boxes. On most land use decisions, it's required to go to the planning commission before it comes to the city council for final approval. That matters don't have to originate with the planning commission. They could be recommendations from staff, recommendations from a member of council, but they then have to go through those paces, right, of planning commission. There's a public hearing and there is notice, and there is the council ultimately ratifying that decision or rejecting that recommendation. So I'd probably recommend we skip the legislative decision. And then if you move on to the administrative decisions, the first section is conditional use permits. These boxes are filled in with how the city's allocated those approval processes now. There's not a requirement that those approvals occur at that level. The code section that authorizes conditional use permits has to be made law by the council, but from that point on, decisions within the conditional use process can be made by entities other than the city council. And then the next section that's quite large is the site plan and all the preliminary approval processes for development applications. And you'll see a number of blank spaces there. And then quasi-judicial, there also are some questions about where do things need to go before they reach that appeal authority. And then one thing that is really not in the matrix much at all is the enforcement process. And I'll note that that's maybe one of the areas where city code has some gaps presently, is how do you enforce some of these land use approvals if they're not honored by the applicant after the decision is made and the action's approved.
If I may, I don't think the goal tonight is to have the council direct all the boxes. I think it's more of the high level, how comfortable is the council delegating authority, and how much do you want the planning commission and the staff to be involved and have that land use authority decision-making role. And if the council's comfortable with that or not comfortable with that, I think that informs the committee's work as we go to work through these boxes and put together a recommendation of how the city code then outlines those roles. That's my general feel of what the committee wants, is just an overall feel of how comfortable is the council in the delegation question.
Just to build upon what Dave's sharing, an example that was brought to the committee, and I'm probably going to say this wrong, but the city council is required to take up an approval of a residential development because they are accepting public features, the road, the curb, the gutter, the sidewalk, storm drain, things of that nature. So for that purpose, because it's accepting it as part of the city's infrastructure, it has to be approved by that body. However, like conditional uses, do we want all conditional uses, permits come back to the city council for approval, or do we want that to be at a planning commission level? How comfortable are we with delegating authority, and what do we want to come back in, and at what level do we want to come back? And that was where we started kind of, where's the rubber meet the road? Where are we comfortable with?
Another example that's pertinent right now is there's a development in process along the north side of South Weber Drive. And it by the nature of the development, it needs to have a subdivision process. So the creation of the lot, and that in our city code, the creation of the lot has to go through a preliminary and then a final at the planning commission, and then only the final at the city council. So the delegation is taking place of the planning commission approves the preliminary creation of a lot, subdivision, and then that final would have to go before city council. However, that very same development proposal, again, based on our current city code, there's nothing that is requiring it to go to city council. And so the site and improvement plans will be reviewed preliminary at the planning commission, and then the developer will create their final plans, and that will also be approved at the planning commission level. And so it will not come before city council. That's one thing that's already delegated in our code. That's not a conditional use permit. It's an administrative decision that the planning commission has that authority over. Some other commercial developments do require the city council, whether it's a conditional use permit or various things that require the site and improvement plans to come up to the council along with the subdivision. So the way our code's written, the subdivision will always come to the city council, but the council has delegated certain approvals all the way through, even if it's commercial, to the planning commission. So again, it's just a comfort level is really what this conversation is. And our code right now has certain things that stop at planning commission, certain things that go to city council. Sometimes it's because it's residential. Sometimes it's because it's commercial. Sometimes it's because it's a conditional use permit. There are all these different things. And again, the code committee, as we try to clarify, as Jamie said, so that it all lines up, we just need that umbrella of where the council feels comfortable.
And if I may, I would like to just kind of offer two camps of thought that happened in this committee. As the one is, we're able to delegate things to the planning commission to help us be able to do our other necessary duties and kind of lift the weight there. The second, the rebuttal to that is that we as city council are the elected officials. And this is a comment I've gotten from many residents, that we're elected to this position. And for example, in the site approval plan, by the time it comes to city council, we are accepting it. As Wayne said, we don't really have the option to change it. But at the end of the day, we're the ones responsible for, as the elected officials, especially where our planning commissions, those positions last longer than the terms of office for the city council, and whether or not that should be power that we want to give to the planning commission, or do we want more say in it earlier in the process?
I think that's why what Jamie outlined is so important about the difference between legislative and administrative, that ultimately the legislative decision sets the table and the administrative decisions are just
Cut and dry.
just
Whichever
making sure
black
that
one.
the program
Volunteer.
happens,
Yeah.
the way that the legislation is written.
Well, and maybe from a city council's perspective, put the other hat on, the developer's hat on, who maybe their expectations is once it's gone all the way up through the approval process and the recommendations going forward, it's not like the city council's rubber stamping it, but they're not expecting the city council to tear it apart and make little minor changes.
That's
It's almost like
exactly
we've gone through all of that. What we're expecting the city council to understand is it meeting with the code? And do we want to accept those features as part of the city's infrastructure or not? But yet it seems like we want to get into in the past, we've wanted to get into it because maybe the codes doesn't cover it. Sound, noise was a particular instance where we had to legislate on that. If I'm using the right words, we can't think of everything, but the idea is to be able to have those codes that are administratively cut and dry. So who's ever making a decision, there it is. It's black and white. Yeah. If we can't think of anything, it's got to be legislative. We keep talking in circles, but it's like, if we get these examples out there, how do we want to move forward?
It seems like a really easy question, but it's not an easy question because
Hence why we're here.
yeah, hence why we're here. But I do feel like as a city council, we're getting way too far. I really do, because people, again, you put yourself in the developer's shoes. They aren't expecting to go through it, like Wayne just said, all the way to city council for final approval, and then it just get completely. No one expects to go spend the type of money for development and do that. That's just not ethical on our part. And so either we got to fix how it goes through those the preliminaries, from the very first step, people have to start looking at it with different glasses on, in my mind. Instead of just checking some boxes really fast, they got to open up, and it probably starts with Barry and staff. And I'm not pointing fingers anywhere. I'm just saying they got to start looking at it as from the broader picture, not just checking boxes that it meets the bottom criteria.
Can we try? I'm sorry, Haley. Can we try an exercise, or if not, I can wait. But the idea was maybe go through what our current process is. Let's take an easy one, like a residential development, and describe very briefly, what are the different steps, and at what point as a council do we want to have a say in any of those steps? As I understand it, there's like a sketch plan meeting when they bring forward their beginning.
So I would actually posture that the council's involved at the very, very beginning. When we talk about the legislative decisions, the general plan is the first
Okay.
land use decision, and that does reside at the city council level. That then informs the rest of that development process. So the thing that happens is the general plan is that first step. Then a zoning decision is made that basically puts the rules of the zone, the rules of the development. That's also made at the city council. So those are the biggest main decision points of what type of use is allowed.
And those are legislative
Those
decisions.
are legislative decisions that the city council makes. And they then give the rules of engagement for development and for staff and for planning commission. Here's the guidelines through the general plan of how we'd like to do zoning. And then we make a decision as a city council. Here's the zone. We'll allow this or not allow this through a rezone. If that makes sense.
Oh, it
At
makes
that
perfect
point,
sense.
then you have the property owner or a developer who's looking to purchase that property and build on it, bring in a concept. And they will bring that concept to staff and say, here's my idea. And staff will then use the general plan and zoning to have a discussion on that concept and say, well, if that's what you want to build, either it fits the zoning, it fits the goals, it fits what the council has said, or if it doesn't fit, then here's the process you'd have to go through to take that rezone request, to take that concept request to the council. So both of those conversations happen at the concept meeting. From a concept meeting, the developer will then take that concept and refine it into what we call a sketch plan meeting. Other cities call it a design review committee or a technical review committee. It's now taking that concept of I'd like to build, a car wash to if I build a car wash, what does the water infrastructure have to look like? What is, it starts to actually put more of a concrete plan in place, substance to that concept. They do that through a sketch plan meeting. At that point, they will then go back and create an actual set of construction drawings, essentially. It's called a preliminary plan. Sometimes it requires a subdivision, again, a creation of a lot. Sometimes it doesn't require that. Sometimes it requires just various things as part of that preliminary set. Sometimes it will require studies. Sometimes it will require whether that's traffic or environmental or geotechnical or whatnot. There's studies that go into that preliminary set of plans. Right now, well, let me finish the process so I don't get stuck. That preliminary set of plans right now goes to the Planning Commission. We have discussed at the retreat earlier in January that at that moment when that happens and it goes before Planning Commission, that we also send those preliminary plans to the city council so that you can be aware of it, you can see it and understand what is being proposed. That's the official moment when a development becomes public, essentially, is that it goes before the Planning Commission with a preliminary set of plans. Again, now, based on the development, whether residential, commercial, whether there's conditional use involved, whether there's a whole bunch of myriad of things, that will determine whether the city council then has to look at the preliminary or not. Typically, the city council does not review preliminary plans. There's still details that are worked out from a preliminary set of plans. For example, one of the things that happens very regularly is a preliminary plan will come forward. The Planning Commission will look at it, and our city planner or our city engineer will say, this looks good to go. It still needs a letter from the sewer district or a letter from the canal company or a letter from the irrigation company that says they will provide the water or something like that. That is not required at the preliminary level. That is something that has to be finalized before the development is finally approved and goes forward. We have been treating preliminary plans more like final plans recently and really wanting a lot of details in those preliminary plans. But ultimately, they take those preliminary plans, those have to be approved, and then they bring that a final set of plans, the actual construction drawings, the landscape, all of that comes back as a final that goes through the process through Planning Commission and City Council. That's the development process. The question of when the council gets involved, I think ultimately is we're trying to get the council involved at the very beginning in the zoning conversation, in the general plan conversation, and especially in the permitted use conversation in the code, right? The legislative decision at the beginning is what allows administrative decisions to take place. And if I could pinpoint one flaw, and one of the reasons we're needing this conversation is that the code isn't so clear on the administrative decisions right now. And so that's why I think the Planning Commission will send something forward. The City Council will say, well, wait a second, because they feel like there's some legislative decisions that still need to be made because the code didn't make it obvious in the administrative role. And it's really kind of blurred the lines of what needs to be decided at the preliminary, what needs to be a decision that's made at the final, who makes that decision, those types of things. But maybe that's a long-winded answer to an easy question, but that's the development steps. The question again is does the council feel comfortable enough in the general plan decision, in the permitted use decision, and then where do they want the preliminary to be completed and finalized? Where do they want the final to be completed?
Well, there's several checks and balances in my mind, and we can go down like a bunch of different rabbit holes, like you're saying, because to go into your last point where the code may not be clear, to answer that question, the code could be specific in saying where the code is not clear at that point in time at the preliminary, maybe that's where it stops. And the legislative body is then asked to add clarification before it's gone all the way to final. And then we have to deal with it at the end, and they've already sunk all those monies. But going back to your very beginning, where it comes back to the council, as he stated, was the general plan, and where the general plan puts certain zones. And I guess the problem we're having right now, not problem, but the difficulties we've been having of late is our commercial and what is allowed in commercial. So we put commercial, a red color, on the general plan, and people generally look at that and say, okay, that seems to fit there. But then somebody comes in here and says, well, we're going to put in a fuel refinery station right there because our code allows it. Is that what we really expected to be there? So it almost comes back to, we as the council, when we review this code, we need to make sure what it says in the commercial development zone is what this city really wants.
Exactly.
Own. Otherwise, we're going to be faced with some things that maybe the public doesn't want. And I think that's where the rubber is going to hit the road. But if we get that right, then the next question in my mind is, we go through the process. There's a lot of authority that could be given to the Planning Commission. It's these conditions, the conditional uses, where the code says, well, that's not a listed use, but it's a condition. And that's where I start getting a little, okay, at what point in time does that have to come back to the council to kind of weigh in on that before, or to me, wait until we get to the final is too late on some of those things. It's almost like our hands are tied and we're the bad guys that we don't agree with. And maybe we're the bad guys because we don't agree with the Planning Commission, or we're not in sync with the Planning Commission. I think we need to be in sync. And I think it all comes down to the black and white. And that's what I'm trying to get to is.
And I agree. I think if we can get the uses pinned down, and I think commercial is our biggest one that's a problem, then I'm comfortable with the general plan and the uses in that general plan and allowing the Planning Commission to do that. I do. And I like the fact that when it goes for that drawing, we get Senate, but we also either need to have an informal thing where we give feedback to that. Right now, we don't give feedback to that, or we're not willing to give feedback to that.
Or we do, and
it gets ignored. But I'm just saying, I get that side of it too. But either we got to have a somewhat of a work meeting for that, so that the council's opinion is expressed, so they know where it needs to go. I don't think we have the same issues once we get those uses that Wayne just talked about pinned down that we're dealing with right now, because those I hope are things in the past. on everybody knows what I'm talking about. And so I think that's why we're all kind of gun shy with this issue is, I think we were all trying to make it the best we could for the city any way we could possibly. And I don't think that's going to be the same way on every development. And so I don't think we need to get into the weeds on every single development like that. But to have that initial preliminary review, I think there needs to be some kind of formal step so that staff, the developer, everybody know they're not blindsided later. That's all I was trying to get at earlier, is so that there is some feedback and some open dialogue. And I think that would improve the relationship with Planning Commission as well.
Can I just ask a quick question? Are we able to do a moratorium while we get our codes in place?
That's a risky,
The answer is yes, you can do a moratorium. It's a limited period of time.
6 months, I understand. I
Jamie
believe.
can give the details on that for sure.
But I thought we were told there has to be a specific reason, not that's just we're redoing code.
Yeah, we could look at it there. I think what it would be essentially is an emergency zoning ordinance that would prohibit development for a period of time. I should note that one of the things that I think is difficult for any city council, and it doesn't surprise me that you're running into this issue, is if you find that the zoning ordinance doesn't state precisely what is palatable to citizens you represent right now, then it can be difficult when a site plan approval comes forward that meets that criteria, but really doesn't look and feel and act and behave the way that you'd like something to. And the challenge is that once a completed application with payments submitted comes forward, then the property owner has a vested right in the property under that existing zoning.
Mm-hmm.
So this is kind of, I agree a lot with what Blair is saying and having these processes cleared up. But what my fear is that we just don't have enough time to do this, and they're coming in faster than. I mean, we've had our code committee now for 2 months, and it's slow going. And I mean, we're still on just the first chapter we wanted to get to, and we have a lot of zones that we want to look at and a lot of things within our general plan. At the rate we're going, this is still going to be another 1.5 years before we get this process where we want it, if we're lucky. So how do we dedicate this time without having things come in with this process that's still out of whack?
And I tried to say this when we started the committee, is that I know we're going through this thing chapter and verse, paragraph at a time, but there are some very glaring issues, mainly in commercial and densities. Can we not just go fix those? I said this before, we know those. Wayne just mentioned one of the key ones for me. That is, they're glaring issues. Just go take them and fix them and get them done.
So
and
maybe
we can vote on it and it's gone.
Take the low hanging fruit of some of those big things.
Exactly.
And if we have to come back and amend it second.
Then we're not sitting there waiting.
The committee did discuss what then that's something we can take back to our committee.
I just think that's the only way to address your concern.
Yeah.
Without doing unless you did a moratorium.
That, and I guess we can ask the committee of, renewed, effort. And how much do we want to, we've missed a couple of committees. There was a storm and some other things came on. So not to make excuses, but should we be meeting weekly and should we be putting a higher effort to it? And I think we need to put that back to the committee as well as staff and put that investment into it until we get to a more, chapter 10, that's the big concern right now. All things, I should say title 10. Did I say that right?
Title 10.
Title 10.
Yeah.
But if forgive me, I thought you were finished. I apologize.
No, go right ahead.
I was just going to say that, we'll take your lead on this. And if you'd like us to triage and as a committee, take those things that are most urgent, fix them, even if it's imperfect, and then take that broader look and work through things and make sure we have a cohesive whole. That's certainly an approach we can take. And that may eliminate the concern that I'm hearing expressed of, are we going to have applications come forward that are complete, but are under a zoning ordinance that we don't right now like?
Yeah. What I'm hearing is the legislative decision that needs to be made first is the uses, the permitted uses in the zones. That is what will make the most effect. Where the committee took a look at it and said, there is a process that we want to address, right? These delegation roles and responsibilities. But what I'm hearing is, let's come back to the roles and responsibilities because we have a process in place. That's not, maybe we want to fix that, but it's not what we want to fix first. Is that incorrect in stating that if we take a step back and say, let's look at the uses, permitted uses and conditional uses, which I would like to clarify that all conditional uses are permitted. You have to allow that use. The conditions, it's not a I'd like it or don't like it. It's not an approve if I want. It's still permitted. We still approve. But is that, am I hearing that right?
Well, I think that was to be honest, that was what initially, I mean, I know we've had some process glitches, but hasn't been the biggest problem. Some of those have saved us, but the uses is what's been the biggest issue, I think. So.
All right, we'll note that. We'll take that back to the committee, and maybe we have two trains going forward, but the higher priority is going to be the uses. Let's see if we can get that back to the council, and then we can continue on with the roles and the legislative process. But to what Blair was going back earlier to say on regards to roles and responsibilities, South Weber is small enough that we can provide that opportunity. And it goes to what Haley was saying, we are elected officials. So maybe at that preliminary, maybe that is a time where we have, I don't know what we want to call it, but some sort of a group discussion where we're able to provide a council feedback to the planning commission as a second piece of information as they're developing the preliminary site plan or preliminary plans. That way we're representing the public body in the process, getting our views out there, but letting the planning commission direct the actual code. And I've got Quinn staring me at the monitor.
Yeah, I was going to ask Quinn.
I'd like to hear you chime in on this a little bit.
Can you hear me on it?
Yep.
Okay. Well, my feelings, I agree with what you said earlier, Wayne, that the areas that are uncertain or unclear should immediately be rolled forward to the city council for comment. And I don't know, Jamie, if that's possible from a code standpoint or a legislative standpoint because of the requirement to have anything that is not clearly defined benefit the applicant. But if anything is not defined, I think that is something that should be brought up to the city council for feedback. It may still need to benefit the applicant, but we can at least have our input. I also agree with trying to get our feedback to the planning commission during the preliminary time. I agree. It seems way too late, and it's not really a good process for it to get all the way through to that point and then have some major concerns finally be brought up.
Thank you, Quinn.
In answer to the first part of your statement, immediate always is a qualified term when you're talking about a legal process, right? But so immediate may mean we can propose something and have it implemented within a 2 to 3 month time frame by the time it goes to the planning commission, you meet the notice and the hearing requirements. But to me, that's a rather immediate change. And you certainly can try to get those things in place before a new development cycle hits and you get applications for those approvals. You're limited in what you can do for existing applications within your pipeline. And for those applications, we have to live with the rules that were written at the time they applied and that the application was complete.
Thank you.
Yes, Dave.
Can I offer one more thing in the goal of brainstorming? What I hear is a number of different issues, but they really all boil down to one in my mind, and that is there's not been a ton of commercial development in the city. We feel strongly that commercial development is important and done the right way when it comes. And in order to use the commercial properties that have been designated through the general plan process and continuing to, be discussed through the general plan process, in order to make sure we do those the best that we can for the best benefit of the city, the goal is to make sure we talk through commercial uses first, that we identify permitted and conditional uses and how that works in our commercial zones. From there, I think from a process standpoint, what I've heard is perhaps, and again, brainstorming, just speaking my mind freely of what's been in here this evening, for good or for worse, is perhaps at the concept plan meeting and the sketch plan meeting. I know there's been representation from the Planning Commission at those meetings. Perhaps we need representation from the council as well at that level, just to provide that council perspective at a concept or at a sketch plan. If you want that, that would be a possibility. The other possibility just that came to my head is when the staff generates the packet and the memos that are written to the Planning Commission based on a preliminary set of plans, perhaps the council provides a memo as well. As I think of the logistics of additional meetings or getting both groups together or whatnot, I think that could be problematic. However, if we send out the material, just like we send it to staff so that they can look at it from a code perspective, and we have a third-party reviewer that looks specifically at certain, fire codes and whatnot, maybe that's the time that the city council has the chance to provide a memo to the Planning Commission just from a council perspective. So that you've got an engineer perspective, a planner perspective, and a council perspective. There are probably other ways to do it, but just trying to think through, if we're not trying to fix the process right now, maybe there's a couple of tweaks that can help while we handle the uses discussion.
So I was looking at other cities and kind of what they do, and I hope you got that email, Jamie. There are some cities that sketch plans are open in public meetings, and a council member attends, a planning commissioner attends, the mayor attends, and it's out there for everyone to be able to see. There's others that have, they just vary. Jamie, can you speak to some of those other processes and at least take into consideration?
One of the things that's really different about your council from other cities is you don't have districts, you're all at large. And so one thing some cities will do is have that process be a little bit collaborative, where you'll have planning commissioners and council members and staff sitting side by side, and they'll usually pick those off by district. So if you have a meaningful development within one council member's district, then that council member can be involved from the get-go to monitor and provide input on that process. And I think that can be really helpful. You will want to think about how you define that process of selecting which member of council would be involved. But yes, that can work really well. And I think that solves the problem Blair was stating at the beginning of trying to be fair to the developers that are putting resources into these processes, that when they move forward, they can expect that the feedback they get is consistent with the things the council will consider when it comes forward with final. And then I think as you clarify your zones, one of the things hopefully you'll find is that the criteria for approving a development will be a little bit clearer, and you then can make those decisions a little bit simpler. Mixed use gets tricky because you're talking about where you're placing structures on the site, where you're placing roadways on the site, where you're placing businesses and residences next to each other. And so you quickly get into conversations that really feel and sound and behave like policy decisions, and can be a little bit difficult to make if the council has a really different perspective on those policies than what the planning commission.
One of the concerns that we've run into in the past with sketch plan meetings, because we did have a planning commission there, and was that some were concerned that perhaps one planning commission member might not have the same opinion and feedback for that developer as another member of the planning commission. And that is kind of why we changed that. So my concern is I think we have 5 council members with varying opinions. And, you know, when we determine which one is going to go to these meetings, or, you know, is that going to reflect the opinion of the whole council? That's my concern with that.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
true.
I was thinking that with the memo, you know, how would we write a memo?
You would almost have to write each council member, if they wanted to give an opinion, send in their own email to the
Correct.
commission. It couldn't be, it'd be pretty hard to do a council.
Right. That was
Memo.
my thought. It wouldn't,
Yeah.
it couldn't be one.
It'd have to be
representative
me
memo.
sending it to the commission as a body.
Yeah.
Haley sending a separate one or something.
Or you use the liaison position that we have, and the council
Well-
members send that memo to the liaison.
And I would be
Summarize.
happy. I would be happy to read it. But I mean, right to Joe's point is, and it's almost magnified on Zoom, to be honest with you, because you're viewed as part of that. I mean, you feel like and so it has been a challenge to not comment because they view that as the council's opinion. And so, I mean, I've had discussion with Rob, and that's why I'm trying not to speak in those Zoom meetings, because it's different, because you're sitting, and when you're here in chambers, it's a little different, but on those Zoom meetings, they were asking me as the council, and that's
A
tough.
6th member of the.
Yeah, exactly. And then it was, so it would have to be, I think, individual ones. And I mean, I was happy to give my opinion when asked, but it was different.
Well, if we're going into the weeds with regards to the process that you brought up, you know, the sketch plan or the design review, I mean, I'm assuming there's some sort of meeting minutes or meeting notes. We get weekly reviews as to what's going on in the city. It wouldn't hurt to be able to just pass that out to the council. We had a sketch plan on this development. Here's the basic concepts of what's going on. We're now being informed of what's going on. Okay, so when it does come up and we do get the memo from the planning commission packet, then we can take a look at it. Is what's there, and we can offer opinions like Blair was saying. And we can work this out in the committee as regards to form and process.
fine.
I don't want to get into it too much here, but I think having meetings on top of meetings, yeah, we're all here to serve, but we're also required to provide an income for our families, and some of us have conflicts in that regard, and we can't have meetings at 8:00 at night every day. Obligation as well, but I've got some clear directions to what we need to take back. I think the process it's clear in my mind, but rather than state my opinion, I think I'm going to table that one and ask that maybe the committee go back and look at the actual uses, specifically highway, commercial, some of the higher priority ones, and start knocking them off. And as soon as we can knock them off, get them under review at the planning commission, get them to the public hearing, get them back to the city council, go through the process, get them adopted. Even if we have to go back and modify them again based upon process and or roles, and administratively clean them up, at least we've got the uses clarified. I think that's the hot button I'm hearing on the other side of the bench. Is that clear? Is that correct?
Yep. For me,
I have a question, Jamie. So there are instances in the code where if you change something here, then it's got feelers all throughout the code. So as far as permitted uses, is that one that's pretty clean cut? Something that we can change easily without affecting other portions of the code? Is that?
Yeah, I
area
think
that
that's
works that
generally
way?
true. Yes. I haven't been here for many of these decisions, being newly appointed in my role with the city, but my perception is that it's conditional uses and those decisions within the scope of a commercial development proposal that are the kinds of topics where the council feels like it needs to be engaged to protect the interests of the citizens in the city. And so one of the things related to your question that I'd like to take your temperature on is, do you want to preserve the council's involvement in decisions at that level?
yes.
I believe the answer is yes,
Yes.
but I think that'll help us, because then as we go into these zoning districts and define more clearly the permitted uses and the conditional uses, I think we also ought to go into the conditional use, the general conditional use approval process, and state more clearly the standards that we will apply to conditional use applications.
Yeah, I
Because
think
some of those standards I see come up repeatedly may not be captured to the level we want them to be. And so we're often left with a square peg round hole kind of an issue when we're looking at those things. It would be helpful for me to hear from you, are there standards you'd like to be in those lists that aren't there right now? And then we can look at it when we look at these zones and have that be one of the high level things we try to attack immediately. And then if we need to, repair it further at a later point in time, we can, but get in a place where you can consider traffic flow on site, and you could consider parking impacts, and you could consider some of the safety and fire lane things that have come up, and hours of operation as well, and kind of light and noise impacts.
Yeah, I was going to add, I think the reason why this work meeting happened is actually from a discussion on CUPs, and usually it comes to city council. I think under residential, it lies with the planning commission for those, and maybe just get a straw poll from the council. I would just like to know from the council, as far as conditional use permits, are you okay with at the planning commission level for residential? Would you like to have final say on all conditional use permits? Just kind of an idea that we can have for the committee to consider. Blair?
Being the only one not on the committee here.
I'm looking at
And
Quinn. I'm looking at
Quinn, what
Blair,
do you
I'm like,
think,
okay.
Quinn? Me and you can talk.
Quinn, can you
Yeah.
say?
Well, being one of the new ones, I didn't realize that we didn't have that authority. And so when I saw that the planning commission was approving some of the short-term rental type things, I felt a little uneasy and would have liked to have had a voice in it. But as long as we have it identified clearly what the expectations are, I think I'm okay with the planning commission, as long as we're clear on that. But if there are still things that are unclear, then I would lean towards having a vote.
Blair, did you have comments on that? Thank you, Quinn.
I mean, I want to say in the ones we currently have a say in. It's just whether or not I want added in residential and some of the other ones. I think the planning commission has done a very good job with the CUPs for the short-term rentals, but they've also been aware of the issues too. I mean, I think the council should have the final say on most CUPs. Wayne, what's your opinion?
My opinion was it's divided. I think the CUPs for residential are pretty clear cut.
They are.
And I think the planning commission does a fine job, but I think the CUPs that go with anything that's not residential, all the other zones, I think they need to come back and we need to have a say on those. And that's why we're asking the discussion, because there's varying opinions and we haven't had the full committee there to ask all their opinions. So
I would agree with that.
I would too. I think our city, just the way it's constructed, I mean, especially the commercial areas, anything that's not a residential zone, they're so few and far between, and we're so inexperienced with those places. We want to make sure that we get it right, because
Agreed.
we don't have a second stab at it. And so,
Already messed up enough.
To that point, I would just like to commend the council for tackling this. I mean, typically the process is, as Jamie outlined, a development comes in and you realize, after the fact, you're like, man, I wish the code was different. And so that's when legislatively the city council will adjust the code for any, additional projects that come in. But it doesn't affect that first project. Well, we don't have too many bites of the apple in this regard. And so I think it's really important for us to, one, tackle what we're tackling and look at those uses in the commercial zones. I think that's really important. But I also think we need to be realistic with ourselves to some degree, that you can write the perfect code, and then you'll find out that it's not the perfect code, because you'll get one development proposal that comes in and you realize that something was different than what you really wanted it to be. And so it's an iterative process. You don't write the code and have the uses and it is one time and it's perfect. We will constantly be reevaluating the land uses and the permitted uses in zones project by project. And so I hope we don't beat ourselves up when we recognize there are things that we'd like it to be different, and there's elements of the code we'd like changed. I hope we don't beat up former councils for maybe missing something or saying that it's somebody's fault. I think that we can learn as we go, and this trying to get ahead of the game is a really important and really valuable step. And the council's taking on something that is nigh unto impossible, is what I'm trying to say, but we can get pretty dang close, I feel. And I think the direction tonight is really valuable to do that.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of cities have the opportunity to do this over and over and to finally get it right. And so when you see a great development in another city, you're like, how did they do that? Well, a lot of that comes from trial and error. We don't have that cushion. I mean, we want to get it right the first time. And anyway, are there other comments or questions?
I would like to hear from our one planning commission who's online and see if they've had any thoughts or things they want to add in.
That is Taylor, yes.
Oh, okay. Taylor, do you have comments?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, excellent. No, it's been really a valuable conversation, and I appreciate the time that the council's put into giving us some further direction. I think one of the things that I like to at least say that I've been working on that might be beneficial in the conversations moving forward was that I've been trying to match the conditional uses and the approved uses for each zone and list them out in a little bit different way. So you'll have the use, and then I'm going to match it to the zone, because Mayor, you made the comment that sometimes it's very difficult to see where we have a use in multiple zones, but that use might be under a different type of ordinance. So I've been kind of chewing on that here the last couple of weeks and trying to outline that in a little bit better organized fashion so that it's easy to see, you know, a gas station in the commercial zone versus the highway commercial zone, and just be able to understand where these uses line out in our code. So, I mean, I think that will be probably a valuable tool as we try to tackle that low-hanging fruit, or at least the target areas that we want to kind of take on under, I guess, Chapter 5 is where all our zoning ordinances start picking up. So that's pretty much it. I really appreciate the direction that you guys have provided tonight.
Great.
I just wanted to say thank you to you, Taylor, for writing up all the roles and responsibilities. It's nice to be able to see where there's holes and where there's unknowns and things that we need to figure out. So I appreciate you working on that.
I'm just glad I spelled everything correctly.
Yeah, you have contributed a lot to this committee, and I appreciate it. Appreciate all your work.
No problem.
Barry,
My
do
pleasure.
you have a comment?
Yes, I have a question actually, because I've heard, I think it's pretty clear that the council wants to have approval authority over conditional uses in non-residential zones. What I'm not clear on is, maybe you're not clear on, is there's another factor, another layer here. In all of our, pretty much all of our non-residential zones, all of our commercial zones, uses, any use, even if it's a permitted use that requires more than 1 acre of land, becomes a conditional use. And therefore, most of them are coming before the council because they're conditional uses. We do have instances where they do not require more than 1 acre. Therefore, they do not slide into that conditional use category. They're just a permitted use. According to our ordinance, the way it's written now, those do not come before the council. The planning commission is the approving authority there. And my question is, are you comfortable with that? Or are you wanting to see all development in commercial zones?
Would that be, for example, would that be the beauty salon that
The beauty salon,
was proposed? So
beauty
that will
salon
not,
and
so
Alpha
that won't
Coffee.
come to council whatsoever.
No, it will not.
So I guess that would be,
That's what I tried to
I was
express
unclear
this
as where.
morning. Yeah, early.
I was-
so
Thank you.
I guess the question would be is, do we want all commercial to come to council?
I'm a yes.
I mean, I think that one was a no-brainer, to be honest with you. I mean, it wasn't a hard one.
I think yes. In generally, I mean, I'm happy with the planning commission could approve it, and I don't have a problem with it because it's like you said, it's a simple one. But I think in the grand scheme of things, all commercial, I think.
Well, and I think it makes it clear for all. I mean, that's Barry. You've explained that I don't know how many times in the last 3 months.
Yeah.
That exact what you just did.
Yeah.
And so I think it just makes a clearer line for the planning commission. It makes a clearer line for us.
To let the
It's
planning
not a-
commission do all
Sorry,
the
I'm
work.
sorry. So Wayne, where are you at? Are
In
you
my
both?
opinion.
Did you answer both?
What did I answer? No, I think all commercial should come back. All conditional use for commercial should come back to the city council, regardless if it's a half acre, 5 acres.
Okay.
If it's commercial, I think we let the planning commission do the preliminary process
Right.
and bring it to that point, but it ultimately needs to come here.
Okay. And I was a little unclear on the residential. For example, Quinn brought up the Airbnb.
Yeah,
That conditional
I'm
use
fine
report
That's a
should come
business though, right?
But it's in a residential
in a
zone.
residential. So that one did not. That was one that kind of flagged me as well. Is it didn't?
And to
Can I
me,
get
I'm
the
fine with-
council's straw poll on how you want the committee to proceed on that?
Quinn, would you like to offer your opinion?
So my thought on the earlier question though is, I agree, all the commercial even under an acre should come to the council. That's my thoughts there. Relative to the residential, if it's a business, I would lean to it coming to the council. If it's just a residential home, then I agree with the planning commission.
We could separate out short-term rentals as a specific element of a residential zone that fits more like a commercial process. That wouldn't be difficult to clarify in the code rewrite.
But I'm open, to the
But I
other
don't-
council's thoughts.
Most cities don't like home-based businesses like other than that. Most cities don't require that to come to council.
Right.
Well,
Right,
so-
if somebody's doing
You're-
hair cutting or whatever, right, yeah.
Your at-home daycares or lawnmower services or whatever would just stay.
There are thresholds you can apply. This may be something the code rewrite committee could consider and then bring forward, but you can, if it's a home-based business that has over a certain number of employees, then you could require the CUP to come to the council.
And I don't, sorry, Wayne, I don't think that's a hot button either, because I think they're doing a pretty good job right now
Yeah.
with it anyway.
Okay.
I really do.
Yeah.
And so I don't think it's a hot button item that has to get tackled immediately. In my opinion, sorry, Quinn, unless it is for you.
No, I don't think it's a hot button one, but I just would add, I agree with the earlier recommendation to address the hot buttons now rather than go through the whole code and then do them all.
Okay.
So short-term rentals, as far as residential business, short-term rentals would be the one that would come
They
to
would be a
council.
category by themselves that would come to council, is what I heard.
Well,
No?
I think that's up to the point of discussion, but right now I'm hearing the majority, at least 3,
Yeah.
are saying that. We still I haven't heard from Angie, but I'm of the opinion short-term rentals can stay with the planning commission. I just feel that's a good place for it to be. If you're going to do home daycares and barbershops or beauty salons and stuff like that, home businesses, but if it gets more than these many people, then okay, you start putting these what ifs up there. To me, it's like if it's residential, and it fits within a residential zone, let the planning commission do the conditional use. If it's a commercial, let it come to council. And I guess I'm of opposing opinion,
Well,
but if I'm a
and
minority
our
opinion-
code now provides better guidelines
Yeah.
for the short-term rentals
Yeah.
for them to follow as well. It gives them
and that's
some
the
pretty
key.
clear Yeah.
That's the key. You got clear
It
guidelines
does.
for the CUP.
I mean-
Then I'm fine with the planning commission following it. So I guess I'm a dissenting vote, but I'm just-
gray on
yeah.
it, but I go back and forth. So
So perhaps what we should do is the committee should just go ahead and write something up and then we'll come
Yeah.
to the council
yeah, I
and we
think
can
we write
deliberate
them
at
up
that
and then
point.
bring it back and then let the council wrestle with it. But yeah,
You got all that,
it's up in the
Michelle?
air, Michelle.
I am using the backspace button.
Put a big question mark.
I didn't know. it
But that's
wasn't
kind of like my
decided.
opinion with all of these and that. I mean, if the committee and staff just come back with all the blanks filled in with what they recommend, then let us say
Weigh in
yes
on
or no.
Yeah.
And go through that matrix. I think that's the best way to handle it.
rather than bring it back to finished product, I think that's what we'll do is I'll bring it back and
Right.
Mhm.
get opinions and then we'll start writing it up, go through the approval process after.
Yeah.
So our next code committee meeting would be next Tuesday at 4:30 prior to council. So we get an hour, 15 minutes. And I'll work with staff as to the agenda and get that out to the committee in a couple of days. And we'll work on the hot buttons. That'll be our primary objective. We'll table this one until we get through the hot buttons. And then we'll proceed according to the committee's desire. Does that work?
I know that I've sent an email previously before we even started this whole process about what those hot button items are. But if you have any of those in your mind of I really would like the code committee to address, XYZ, and you feel strongly about that being a hot button item, I think to me or to Wayne as the committee chair to
I'll just have you could take all the emails and you can consolidate
send them
that.
to me. We can put them together so that we
Yeah.
know what the council is considering a hot button item, because I think council members probably have different opinions on what is a priority. So that'd be great.
Does that work for you, Quinn? Thumbs up on Quinn. All right.
Yep, I'm good with it.
All right. Are there any other comments or questions before we?
I'd like to thank the council for allowing us to put this on the agenda and spend some valuable time. It's given me some good guidance and hopefully Haley as well to proceed further. So thank you for allowing this, Mayor.
Yeah, it's been a good discussion. Dave, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I wanted to reiterate really the same thought that this is a big item and this is a really important discussion about where the council is comfortable and we've kind of talked around it a little bit, but Wayne kind of hit it right on the head there at the end that when we're as a council able to clearly write the code, that frees up the rest of the process. That frees staff and planning commission and the developer, property owners, the residents in such a great way. And so just the recognition that clarity is valuable and then tackling that, that's a really big deal. And it's not an easy process. There's a lot of big items on this, but just a recognition on my part and an appreciation on my part is was already stated that it's really important that we're doing it this way. And this is a great thing that the council's tackling as a group. So thanks for lifting heavy things for this community.
All right. And committee chair, do you feel like you have good direction now? We're ready to plow forward.
Yep.
Move forward.
You have great direction with the first step. After that,
After that, the GPS says rerouting,
GPS is like,
rerouting.
recalculating. So yeah, we'll take the first step and we'll go from there.
We'll go one
We
step
already
at
were
a
told
time.
the U-turn, so.
I think we're
No,
plowing
we're-
backward, not forward. We're plowing. Rerouting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll get there.
Okay, Quinn or Taylor, did you have anything else to say before we?
I don't have anything else. Thank you very much.
All right. Taylor, anything? Are you good?
Sorry, it takes me a while to unmute. No, I'm good. Again, I appreciate the time.
Okay. All right. Haley or Blair, anything more to?
No, ma'am.
Nope.
All right, then I will entertain a motion to, do
Move to adjourn.
I have a second? All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay. Meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everyone.